Well, today we're moving on to what is far and away the most popular scale, HO scale.
That's the one I'm familiar with.
Well, it's always been, well, since it was created, it's been the most popular, ranging anywhere from about half of the modeling industry all the way out to about 90% of all model railroads. We've seen some just fabulous HO model railroads. This is Lee Nicholas's Colorado Western, and it's been published in international model railroad periodicals. It's best known for its realistic operations.
Right.
It's crazy how far they've taken it, assigning everybody a job, dispatching from an actual Union Pacific dispatch center. They've really taken this to the ultimate level. And this is Tom Hawley's Denver and Rio Grande Western in Grand Junction, Colorado. Huge. He's got somewhere close to 100 scale miles of track.
Oh, goodness.
In a specially dedicated custom-built building. It allows them to run full-size prototype trains.
Nice.
He's also weighted the cars so they're the exact right prototype weight. But you see these huge, huge trains on this huge railroad, and it's just mind-boggling.
Oh, no kidding.
And this is Ralph Gochner's Utah Pacific, and best known for all of its automated features.
Oh, I love this railroad.
Oh, this is such a special railroad. It's all, there's a lot of brass, a lot of scratch-built brass, but what really gets the attention is the automation. But no matter where you go, train shows, wherever, most of what you're going to run into is HO.
It's a nice size.
It's really emerged as the perfect size. So we mentioned before when we were talking about S scale that S and HO are both these half scales. S is 1/2 of gauge 1 and HO is 1/2 of gauge 0. Now both of these scales, however, were corrected to make the gauge a proper prototype 4 feet 8.5 inches, because in their original variations, O and gauge 1, they were done to a 5-foot prototype gauge, which is wrong. They should have been done to 4 feet 8.5 inches. Now, the very first HO train that was manufactured was made in Great Britain by Bing in 1922, but it was a clockwork train, a little spring-wound train that you would wind up, as they couldn't quite figure out how to fit an electric motor inside such a small locomotive. The first actual electric train released in HO was in 1935 by Marklin. Now, it's widely held that the HO stands for half O. It actually stands for Hab Null in the German. Keep in mind that O was not the letter O, it was the number null, 0. And so when the Germans created this, they called it Hab Null. And for the same reasons that the larger trains all ran on AC and 3-rail track, so the Marklin HO trains also had AC motors and ran on a 3-rail track. And while they have gone over to using DC, I think they use both AC and DC on Marklin. Not sure if you know, jump into the comments, but they're still using 3-rail track to this very day.
Well, that's a well-hidden track. I don't see 3 rails.
Yeah, it's just these little teeny nubs sticking up out of the middle of the ties or sleepers, and boy, does that do a good job of hiding that center rail.
No kidding.
But if you roll this over and look at the back side, the hot leg of the AC is being carried down a center bus, just like it is on Lionel 3-rail, something like that.
That's interesting.
Isn't that cool how they've done that?
No kidding.
Marklin was created by Theodor Friedrich Wilhelm Marklin in 1859. And they created their first train set in 1891. And they created gauges 1 through 5 that same year. And then they added zero gauge, not gauge, in 1895. So when the British Society of Model Engineers adopted those first 6 gauges, they were really just formally standardizing the Markland gauges.
Well, that's a beautiful engine.
Isn't that spectacular?
Oh my.
So Markland, even from the earliest days, was really trying to create well-detailed models in this smaller, diminutive scale, HO. But HO was emerging as the craftsman, the model, the well-done model railroad, if you will. And even some of the later plastic models, just super, super detailed. If you look closely here, you can see that center rail pickup down between the wheels there.
Right.
At any rate, in 1936, the National Model Railroad Association, the NMRA, the newly formed group in the United States, decided to create a set of standards for all these different gauges and scales. And they got together with MOROP in Europe, who created the NEM standards. And they wanted to come to some level of agreement between the two groups so that the standards would be the same. And the NMRA standards had already been adopted in the Netherlands, and so it made sense to continue with finding common ground, if you will, between the two groups to create an international standard. Now, the decision was made to not just simply divide O gauge in half. O gauge was originally 1 1/4 inches, which is 31.75 millimeters. And so 1/2 of O would have been 5/8 of an inch, but an awkward 15.875 millimeters. And so they wanted to make some adjustment here so that the numbers made more sense. And so the gauge was adjusted down to 16.5 millimeters, which is 0.65 inches. So those were easy numbers to work with in both inches and millimeters. It also worked out to a scale of 3.5 millimeters to the foot, or 1/87th scale. So again, easy numbers to work with, and it corrected that problem of the 5-foot gauge being inaccurate, correcting it down to a prototype 4 feet 8 1/2 inches. Now, for some reason, in the United Kingdom, they did not want to follow these recognized scales. They did agree to use 16.5 millimeter gauge, but they wanted to create their own scale, double aught. And that works out, it's 4 millimeters to the foot, or 176.2 scale. And the question has always been why? Why in the world did they do that?
Yes.
Well, the widely held belief is that because their prototypes tend to be much smaller than in the United States and Germany, they wanted a somewhat larger model, and so they went to 176 scale just to make the locomotives a little bit bigger so that the motor would fit in there.
Ah.
I also wonder, 176 was taking off as a recognized scale for other kinds of modeling, particularly military modeling, and I wonder if they didn't want to just match to a more conventional scale rather than 1/87th. At any rate, these British models are done in this somewhat larger scale. They're beautifully done.
Oh, yes.
And they will run, if you wanted to buy one of these, they will run on your HO track, but they're just going to be somewhat larger. And then they have their own couplers and so on, which makes them unique that way as well. But double O, or double aught, is virtually unknown in the rest of the world. It's a peculiar, particularly British modeling scale. Again, the gauge is not unique. It's the same 16.5 millimeter HO gauge. It's just that the scale is different. Now, in 1932, Bing, who came out with that very first HO train, became Trix. And Trix is still around. And in 1938, Meccano, who made the British version of Gilbert's erector sets. In fact, Gilbert just copied them. They're the ones that originated the idea. But they created a new division that they called Hornby Dublo. Dublo. It's just kind of a funny way of saying 00. 00. And Hornby is still very much around. It's moved around and gotten reorganized and so on. I understand it's now a Spanish company, but they're still making British prototypes in Dublo scale. And isn't this a beautiful engine? This is the Harry Potter Express, the Hogwarts Express.
Oh, I love that one. I just love Harry Potter.
And this has been a really popular locomotive to buy internationally, and as it will run on HO gauge track, and it uses all the same electrical standards, you can buy one of these and run it on your HO railroad.
You need a 9 3/4 platform.
As long as you don't need a 9 3/4 gauge. Anyway, it will run on your HO railroad should you want to buy one, even though the scale is different. Okay, back to our old friend DC versus AC. One of the things that was holding up a lot of toy trains were their reliance on AC, because the AC motors are more expensive, they're bigger, and it was just much more difficult to create a train that runs on AC, but there was no effective way of creating DC. And so all of the early train sets ran on AC and therefore on three-rail track as well. But in the early days, a DC rectifier required a vacuum tube.
Right.
And that was, again, complicated and expensive, and nobody wanted to do that. But there was another system for creating DC. And it was called a rotary converter.
A what?
A rotary converter.
Oh, boy.
Now, this is a particularly monstrous rotary converter. But it does kind of illustrate how this whole thing works. It's an AC motor connected to a DC generator.
Oh.
And a DC generator is the same thing as a DC motor, and an AC alternator is the same as an AC motor. So if you hook AC to the AC motor, DC comes out of the DC motor. If you hook DC to the DC motor, AC comes out of the AC motor.
Good grief.
So you can convert AC to DC and DC to AC with these rotary converters. And then a lot of them, all of the mechanism was internal. It just looked like one single motor.
Ah.
Anyway, a lot of the early model railroaders just built their own.
I imagine to save money and...
Yeah, and it was so simple to do. You just needed an AC motor, a DC motor, connect the two together, connect their shafts together, and you could even put a flywheel on there.
Goodness.
And that's what John Allen did here on The Gory and Defeated. And he preferred that system of generating his DC because it made his trains coast.
Oh.
Because of the flywheel on his rotary converter.
I see.
Then he could also put a potentiometer across the track current, and that gave him a brake. If he moved that handle, the trains would come to an immediate stop because the voltage would be shunted through the resistor. It meant that he had a throttle that responded slowly with momentum, and a braking system and trains that would coast.
Nice.
Very realistic. Anyway, the simple solution to this happened just after World War II, 1946, when the silicone PN junction diode was perfected.
Right.
In fairness, it had been around since the 1700s.
Yes.
But you could only run a few milliamps through it. And then in 1946, they came up with a fully operational one that was very small, about the size of a pencil eraser, and could still handle 3 to 5 amps, something like that. So suddenly they were able to produce very, very affordable DC power packs for running trains.
Nice.
In any scale, but it really helped launch HO. Because DC motors are not only smaller and simpler, they're cheaper.
Right.
And part of what made HO so popular is because it was small and because it had these very affordable components in it, it was a very, very affordable thing to buy.
Right.
Or to give for Christmas.
Oh boy.
And the other big innovation was plastic.
Oh boy.
Now, plastic had been around for a long, long time. Polystyrene was invented in the 1930s. But because of, the Depression and World War II and a few problems like that, it didn't really grow into its paws until the late 1940s, post-war.
Right.
And suddenly plastic was being used to make HO trains. Well, to make all trains. But again, it really helped launch HO.
Well, speaking of launch.
Yeah. Well, plastics also created a whole new hobby, plastic modeling.
Boy, I'll say.
And in the 1950s, the 1960s, the number one activity for kids was building plastic models.
Oh, wasn't it though?
It was bigger than video games.
Oh, I don't remember a video game. We had pinball, but
It was just huge. And then plastic models in HO scale it just really took off. And if you were doing model railroading, building plastic models in HO scale was the thing.
I bet it was more affordable too.
A lot more affordable. And then the detail was better.
Oh yeah.
And plastics meant that track would be so much easier to insulate from the left rail to the right rail. That helped just completely eliminate the need for any sort of center rail.
Ah, right.
And mass production of very affordable and very realistic looking track became a thing.
Look at that, yes.
Isn't that beautiful? The
That's
early
right.
Atlas Snap Track, they called it. But it was plastic. Their original ones had sort of a fiber tie. But they quickly went to an injection molded plastic and very affordable, very good looking. Again, it really helped propel HO into the forefront of model trains. And manufacturers from all over the world, these are the Italian Rivarossi, and the tooling was all done by Poacher. We've covered these in the past, some of these models that were machined by Poacher for Rivarossi and then imported in the 1950s and 60s by AHM. But lots of different plastic locomotives, very, very affordable, lots of plastic rolling stock, really good looking, really affordable, and also structure kits. Just hundreds of new structure kits coming out all the time, all in HO, all in plastic. And I think some of the best plastic rolling stock was being made by Athearn. And I want to mention Athearn because the stuff was really, really nice, still around, still really, really nice. But a lot of people don't know that it was sort of a Salt Lake company.
Really?
Yeah, it was Irv Athearn from California, but his good friend Jack Douglas in Salt Lake got involved in construction of these Athearn kits, and all of the boxes were being stuffed, if you will. All the parts were being put in the boxes, and the boxes sealed up in the basement of Douglas Models on 2nd South, just east of State Street.
How about that?
All these blue box Athearns were all being assembled in Salt Lake City.
Nice.
Now, while some of these cheap plastic HO trains are really sort of looked down on, here on Ralph's Railroad, his operating coaling tower is actually a Tyco. It's a Tyco car and a Tyco unloading ramp that he's reworked into this just amazing functional coaling tower.
Isn't that neat?
Isn't that neat? And when he tells people it was made by Tyco, they go, no.
No way.
But the fundamental mechanism and the cars are all Tyco.
Isn't that something?
So just the cheapest of the cheap HO plastic stuff.
Nice.
But there it is.
There it is. It's really cool.
So it sort of makes a lot of sense that HO would just take off as the absolute most popular gauge and scale of trains.
Oh, I can certainly see why.
The detail is great. It's small enough that you can fit it into a tighter space, and originally at least so much more affordable.
Right.
And to a large extent still is, even though a lot of the HO stuff is very expensive, it's still much cheaper than the larger scales, for example, O scales, something like that.
Right.
Anyway, if you're not a subscriber to the channel, please become a subscriber by clicking on the blue button. Are we ready for that? Zoink! Right there, the blue button. Well, we're not sure how you found this video on the internet. We hope you didn't find it boring, and we will see you here on Sunday. We'll see you then.
We'll see ya.
Bye-bye.
Bye.